Hi there, and thank you for joining our food safety training for today. So today we're going to be covering safe food handling practices for both food pantry workers and for meal program workers. So if that sounds like you, you're in the right spot. This will satisfy your food bank food safety training requirement for up to 5 years. There will be a short quiz at the end just to confirm that you got the information that you needed and for us to actually be able to give you credit for taking this training. So make sure that you stick around for that. So what are we going to cover today? So our learning objectives for the day is how food becomes unsafe, your role in keeping food safe, preventing foodborne illness, which foods are potentially hazardous, how to evaluate food that comes in, how to understand food dates, what happens when there's a food recall, and then we'll get into some things that are a little bit more specifically applicable to our meal sites. So everyone will stick with us for this first biggest portion of the training since everyone is storing food. And then at a certain point, I'll give you all a heads up that if you are a food pantry worker, you're welcome to take your quiz and drop off of the training. And then if you are a meal site worker, we've got a little bit extra content to cover with you all. So the last part of the training will cover serving food safely, cleaning and sanitizing in your kitchen, and then of course there'll be a little quiz for you all as well. So foodborne illness. So the CDC estimates that in the US each year, about 48 million people end up with some type of foodborne illness. And this ends up resulting in about 3,000 deaths and 128,000 people hospitalized. So that's why we take foodborne illness so seriously. Of course, everyone's different with how they respond to foodborne illness and the severity. Some of us just maybe have some gastrointestinal effects for a few hours or a few days. But as you can see, it can also be really, really serious in certain situations as well. So that is why we cover so much about food safety for our partners. And so the main causes of foodborne illness are, of course, bacteria and viruses. So the bacteria and viruses fall into what we call the biological types of hazards to food safety. And that's what we're going to be focusing on most today. So biological hazards to food include, of course, those bacteria and viruses that we just talked about, but can also include parasites and fungi. Now, a couple other types that we also like to touch on are physical hazards. So that would be, for example, if a little shard of glass chipped off of, a container that you were using and ended up in the food and someone ingested that. Same thing with, earring backs, bandages, anything like that, something physical that can make its way into the food and cause harm. And then chemical is another type of hazard. So this one is almost a little bit counterintuitive because when we end up with a chemical hazard, it's usually something that we're using with the intention to keep food safe, like some kind of cleaner or sanitizer. But if that leaks down into our food or somehow contaminates the food that we're making, that can also be a poisoning concern. So those are the three types of hazards. Like I said, we'll be focusing mostly today on the biological hazards. So foodborne illness and emergency food programs like you. So why is this especially important at an emergency food program? Of course, it's because you're working with the public and you're working with large numbers of people. But it's also important because some of the people that you serve could be especially susceptible to foodborne illness. And you can't always tell who is high risk for foodborne illness. So some groups that are especially high risk might include seniors or low-income persons, children and pregnant women, and then also people with chronic diseases or people who are taking any type of medication that might suppress their immune function. So it's always best to assume that you are serving a high-risk population and take appropriate precautions. So I like to kind of start off this training with just kind of placing us in the context of everything that happens to our food before it even gets to us. So food makes a lot of stops before it arrives in our kitchens, and it can become contaminated at any step in this process. So a lot of food might already have some type of pathogen on it when it arrives in our kitchen or in our pantry. Some pathogens are harmless for us, some are not harmless for us. Some can be cooked off in the cooking process, some cannot. Some might be okay in small doses, but then maybe they can multiply if we don't handle the food correctly. So obviously, this is the part of food safety that we have a little bit less control over, but there are still some things that we can do to mitigate the impacts of all of these steps needing to go right before it arrives in our kitchen. So some things that we do have a lot of control over. We have control over how we store food. We have control over preventing cross-contamination. We have control in our meal kitchens over whether we are properly cooking, thawing, and storing our potentially hazardous foods. And we also have control over whether food is being handled by someone who is ill. So staff health and hygiene is one of the most important things that we can pay attention to prevent foodborne illness, right? If someone who has a foodborne illness, like maybe salmonella or, E. coli, anything like that, those pathogens can end up transferring from our bodies into the food that we're preparing, and then, of course, to the end client who is consuming this food. So unfortunately, we call this the fecal oral route, which is not wonderful to think about, but it essentially means that, bacteria from our GI tracts can end up in food, and that is one of the really common ways that food becomes contaminated. So staff health and hygiene, some things that you can do are to stay home if you're sick, of course, avoiding bare hand contact with food, always having clean attire, right? If we're wearing an apron in the kitchen, for example, we don't wear that apron into the bathroom or to go take out the trash. We can use gloves and hair nets in our kitchens. And hand washing is going to be one of the most important parts as well, which we'll get into in a minute. Illness screening. So if you're experiencing or your volunteers are experiencing any type of gastrointestinal issue like vomiting, diarrhea, or nausea, you definitely will want that person to stay home from their shift at the pantry or the kitchen for a while. And a big reason for that is that sometimes with these different illnesses that we're looking out for, people can be contagious well before and well after they're experiencing symptoms. So a lot of times people might not even know that they're contagious, but if they're still working with food, they can still be transferring those pathogens and infecting others potentially. So especially if you're currently symptomatic with any of these things, definitely want to skip our shift for that day. And then same thing if you're having any open wounds, sores, or rashes. And even though it's not necessarily a foodborne illness concern, if you are having any cold, flu, or COVID symptoms, again, a lot of times you might be serving a high-risk population, so it's best to stay home on those days as well. So what percent of foodborne illness is caused by improper hand washing? So it's actually 34%. So about a third of foodborne illness could be prevented by doing something as simple as washing your hands correctly. So if you can just do that one important step well, you're knocking out a huge portion of your risk. So proper hand washing means that you wet your hands with water as hot as you can comfortably stand. You want to make sure to build up a good lather with your soap and vigorously scrub your hands and arms for 10 to 15 seconds, making sure to hit, wrists, fingernails, in between fingers, every part of our hand and forearm. And then you want to rinse, of course, with water and dry your hands and arms with a paper towel or a hand dryer that you also use to turn off the faucet and to let yourself out of the bathroom or whatever room that you are washing your hands in. So the whole process of washing should take about 20 seconds. I'm sure a lot of people have heard the, recommendation to sing the happy birthday song. And I used to think that that 20 seconds rule was kind of just arbitrary, just they wanted to make sure you washed your hands for a while. But it's actually that it takes about 20 seconds for soap to actually break down the outer membranes of a virus. So if we're not washing for that full 20 seconds, we're not actually letting the soap do what it needs to do, and it's a lot less effective. So that's the reason for that 20-second rule. So some spots that are really commonly missed when hand washing include the fingertips, in between the fingers, forearms as well. That's not in this diagram, but that is another big one. And then also thumbs can be missed as well. So those are some areas to pay some extra attention to. And hand washing is extra important after using the bathroom, after coughing or sneezing, after touching garbage, after drinking, and basically whenever you change between two different tasks, it's a good idea to wash your hands there. So we always like to share this Michigan State study in which about 3,700 people were observed in public restrooms. And when they looked at how many of those people washed their hands for at least 20 seconds, it was actually only 5%. And I bet if you would ask those people, hey, did you do a good job washing your hands in there? They would have been like, yeah, of course I did. So I think a lot of us don't always conceptualize how long 20 seconds actually is. So it's really uncommon for people to actually wash for the full 20 seconds, even though it's so important. The average time that people did wash their hands for was about 6 seconds, and about 10% of people did not wash their hands at all. So we get a lot of questions here at the food bank about whether it's okay to just use hand sanitizer instead. And the answer is that hand washing is actually always more effective than hand sanitizer. Hand sanitizer can be used in place or after hand washing, but not in place of hand washing. Of course, if you have no other option where you happen to be at, maybe you're doing a field distribution or you're somewhere where you don't have access to a sink, of course, hand sanitizer is better than nothing. But when possible, hand washing is always ideal. For hand sanitizer that you might keep on your site, always try to make sure that it has at least a 60% alcohol minimum to make sure that it's the most effective type of hand sanitizer. So now we'll get into a little bit about our food prep and food storage areas. So in those areas, we always want to make sure that we are not eating, drinking, or smoking. If you're a site coordinator, it's always helpful to have a designated area where volunteers and staff can do that so that they know where these things are acceptable. And of course, we want to keep our food storage areas very clean and sanitized. So what things do we need to clean and sanitize? Basically anything that is coming into contact with food. So food storage bins, any type of surface like a table or a shelf that you're keeping food on. And of course, in a kitchen, any prep surfaces, dishes, utensils, anything like that. So we'll get into more detail later on about sanitizing items that are going to be used in a kitchen. But for now, we're focusing still on kind of our food storage areas and things that are applicable to food pantries specifically. So those food storage bins and surfaces are going to be your big ones. So you can sanitize with any type of sanitizing solution that you like. We recommend using a bleach solution of about a tablespoon of water per 1 gallon, or bleach per 1 gallon of warm water. And you can either soak items in it or make a spray. We recommend making a new one each day because that does lose its efficacy over time if it's sitting around. And you want to make sure to pay attention to contact time as well. You can read your bleach container for specific instructions, but usually you need to let the bleach have contact with the surface that you're sanitizing for at least a minute to make sure it has time to do its job. But again, always just follow the manufacturer's instructions on whatever sanitizer that you're using. So like we mentioned earlier, we are still, dealing with COVID, flu, colds, all that good stuff. So while it's not a food safety concern, it is still a good idea to keep your frequently touched surfaces clean and disinfected. So that's anything like your doorknobs, your equipment handles. If you're using any type of grocery cart or basket for clients to shop with, you always want to make sure that you're wiping those down at least once a day with a common disinfectant, like maybe a Lysol, Clorox wipes, anything like that. And we always like to remind everyone not to mix any type of cleaning chemicals. So now we'll move into a little bit about receiving and evaluating food. So this could be food that you are purchasing independently. It could be food from the food bank, or it could be donated food that maybe you're picking up from a retail partner. So the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Food Donation Act. So this is an act that was put into place to make sure that people and organizations felt protected from any liability when they're donating food to a nonprofit. So essentially, if someone, God forbid, were to get sick from food that was donated, as long as that person or that organization or that store wasn't actively being negligent with their storage and handling of the food up until the point of donation, they're protected from criminal liability. So if you ever hear from a store or a community member that they're nervous to make a donation to you for this reason, you can let them know about this Good Samaritan Act. So when you're receiving food, so again, this could be from a donor, purchased food, or food from the food bank, you always want to make sure that you are checking for any abnormal odors, pests, or ice crystals that could indicate refreezing. Packages should always be sound and undamaged. Any type of meat, poultry, seafood, or dairy product should be stored at 40 degrees or below when it arrives. If it's above that temperature, you would not want to accept that food. And then you always want to check the thermometers check the temperatures with a thermometer when possible. So for example, if you get, say, a shipment of milk, obviously you don't need to open up a thing of the milk and put the thermometer in there, but you could take 2 jugs of the milk, put the thermometer probe down in between them, and press them together to get a good reading. If you do receive food that you're kind of going back and forth on and you're not sure if it's okay, always err on the side of caution since you are serving the public. So if you're having a lot of doubts about whether certain food is okay, always err on the side of caution and do not distribute it. So now we'll break down a few different categories of food, and we'll start with our shelf-stable or dry category of food. So when it comes to canned food, 2 things that we definitely cannot accept and distribute are home canned foods and cans without labels. So the reasoning on the home canned foods is that as nice as it is if someone donates to your pantry some food that they can themselves, canning has to be done in a really specific way to make sure it's safe. And we don't necessarily know what types of canning processes that person used. So because it's risky, we unfortunately cannot accept those. And for the cans without labels, labels are important because we need to have nutrition facts on there. We need to know exactly what's in the can, the date that it expires, and we really need allergen info on there as well so that people know what they're consuming. So when you're evaluating canned food, you want to discard any cans that you find that have swollen or bulging ends, or that have sharp dents on the top seam, so that top circle or bottom circle area of the can, or the side seam. A lot of times a can will have kind of a vertical seam running down one side of it. Sharp dents on either of those areas are especially risky, so we do not want to mess with those. Of course, if a can was leaking, had a hole in it, was rusting, anything like that, that would not be safe either. And then if it has buckled or pinched ends, like in that yellow photo on the screen there. Really shallow dents can be okay. Obviously, use your best judgment, but err on the side of caution. So in this scenario, if we were checking out these two cans, we would want to discard can A because it's got that bulging area on the top. So now if we're looking at food that's in a bottle or a jar, like say a pasta sauce, we talked about earlier that physical contaminants to food can be a problem. So if you're noticing that there are chips or cracks in the glass, we don't know if a little shard of glass could have gotten out into the product. Even if it's not actively leaking, we want to discard those things. Same with, of course, if it's actively leaking or if the product inside does not look right, we would not want to distribute that. Some of those kind of tamper evident seals and vacuum lids and things like that can be really helpful if you notice that the vacuum or the pop-up button is already lifted. We don't want to distribute that. Same with if there was a plastic sealer on the top that is gone, we would not want to distribute that either. Now for bagged and sacked food, so thinking things like flour, sugar, that type of thing. If the bag had any rip, tear, or hole in it, we would not want to distribute that. Of course, if we saw rodent or insect damage on it, if the label was missing or if it was not readable anymore, we would not want to distribute that. And then because the only thing standing between the outside environment and the product inside is just that paper or, the paper kind of cardboard sack, if there was any stain or contaminant on that outer paper, we would need to discard that food as well, because that's not an effective way to protect the food inside. So if something spilled on that bag of sugar, for example, we would need to discard it. Now, if we're talking about a box that has an inner bag, like maybe a box of Pop-Tarts or a bag or a box of cereal that has a plastic bag inside, that affords kind of a second layer of protection for the food inside. So that gives us a little bit more wiggle room, right? So if the outer box is damaged, you can check out the inner bag. And as long as the inner bag looks okay, that food is still okay to distribute. But of course, if the inner bag itself is leaking or contaminated, or you see something strange inside of there, or there's signs of insects, that would not be something that we'd want to distribute, of course. And then boxes that don't have an inner bag, we treat that very similar to what we talked about with the bagged and sacked food, right? If there's any type of stain on the box, if it's opened, ripped, signs of insects, those are the types of things we would not want to accept and distribute. So how about when it comes to produce? So produce can always be a funny one because everyone has a little bit of a varying degree of tolerance for some imperfections on their produce, right? But the things that we definitely are not okay with would be, of course, any produce that has mold, anything that's decaying or rotting or smells off. And then severe bruises can unfortunately also be a problem because it's weakened the skin and potentially even broken the skin in that area. And those bruises can provide a way for pathogens to get inside the produce. So if something is very severely bruised, unfortunately, we would want to compost that or, donate it to our local pig farmer, whatever you do with your kind of organic matter at your pantry. Items from farms or donations maybe look a little bit different than the perfect produce that you would see in the grocery store. And so different shapes are totally okay. Different, maybe a different color is okay. But if you see any of those considerations, you would definitely not want to distribute it. So I'll give you a couple minutes here to check out this little display of a potential food storage area in someone's pantry. What are some things here that you notice that are wrong? So we've got an unlabeled can, a few unlabeled cans, dented can, and here we have bleach actually stored above our food, which we never want to do. We always need to store our cleaning chemicals and any type of really non-food items on a different shelf, at least 6 feet away from our food products. Of course, here too, we have a leaking product. We have steak in our dry storage area. We have things sitting on the floor. We always want our food to be at least 6 inches up off the ground. And it looks like we've got a torn bag as well. So these are some things you would want to look out for in your own food storage areas. So let's do a little scenario here. So let's say that you are sorting food from a food drive at your pantry and you notice that you have this box of macaroni and cheese. What should you do with this macaroni and cheese and why? So the best by date on it is May 20th of 2022. So because that is more than 1 year ago, unfortunately, we could not use that macaroni and cheese anymore. 1 year is about our kind of rule of thumb for how long you can keep a dry or boxed food past its date. So as you all know, we can use food after the sell by and best by dates. The reason for this is because a lot of products are still safe well beyond the package date, as long as they've been properly stored and the container still looks good. And the reason for this is that a lot of times these dates are more related to quality than safety, or it might be kind of a safeguard for the manufacturer or a way for the manufacturer to make sure that people buy new products from them regularly. The term best by means that it's the last day that the manufacturer can guarantee the highest quality, right? That doesn't mean that the food is automatically unsafe the day after the best by date. It's just kind of a quality related date. And then the sell by is the last day that the product can be offered for sale at, for example, a grocery store. And built into that sell by date is the assumption that someone's going to take that food home from the grocery store and maybe store it a while themselves before they actually prepare it. So the sell by dates are a little bit confusing as well. So we do have a resource on our website called Is This Food Still Good? And it has some really specific considerations for how to know if a food is still good and how long different foods can be kept past their date. So we have kind of general categories that you can post as guidance at your organization. And then we also have a list of really specific breakdowns of specific foods. So beans, pancake mix, bread or cake mix, you can see all those are listed out with a note of how long past the best by date that it can be kept for. And of course, if you ever run into any questions about this, you can always ask our food bank team as well. We're happy to give you some guidance. So clients can also end up with questions about whether food is still good. And I'm sure as a lot of you have experienced, sometimes if you are distributing something that's past the date, it can make people feel really uncomfortable to take that home with them because they think it's maybe not safe or not good anymore. Having that conversation with clients is really important so that they don't feel disrespected by being offered food that's past the date. Again, some people might not be comfortable with it still, and that's totally okay. People can make their own decisions about how they feel about food past the date. But we do have these little, is this food still safe cards that are a good opportunity to educate the public about how long past best by dates foods are still good for. If you would like some of these, get a hold of us at the food bank. We're happy to get them out to you so that you can share these with clients as well. They're just little kind of postcard size resources that you can hand out. When we are storing food, we want to pay attention to our time, our temperature, and ventilation. Storing food in our dry areas, we want to ideally have the temperature of those areas be somewhere between 50 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit, which is pretty typical indoor temperatures. This is just a best practice to maximize the shelf life of products. So essentially it extends their quality. Not always attainable, but this is the ideal scenario. Like we discussed, all food always needs to be 6 inches off the floors and away from walls and ceilings to help with ventilation. Labeling the receiving date of products is good so that you can ensure proper rotation. And the oldest food should go out first, or the food that has the soonest date on it. And then, of course, the newer food or the food that's best by date is further out should be distributed last. So we call that FIFO, or first in, first out. It's a good idea to try to order in a way that allows you to rotate your stock at least every 3 months. So if you're noticing that food is hanging around for longer than 3 months, you may be ordering a little bit too much of it at a time. Again, feel free to work with our food bank team on kind of right sizing your order for your levels of distribution. And again, like we talked about, we always want to store anything chemical separately away from food. And we do actually count things like shampoos and personal hygiene products as chemicals as well. So all of those things should be stored far away from food and definitely never above food. Let's talk for a minute about pests. So let's say that you are cleaning the floor of the pantry when you notice that there are a few ants going around. What should you do and why? When you notice pests, you of course want to try to figure out where exactly they came from, right? If there's a really obvious crack in a window or you can see that they're coming in right under the door, and you can block off that area and observe whether that fixes the problem. And if it was just a few ants and it's all good after you block off that crack or you seal off that crack, then wonderful, you're good to go. What we don't want to do is use really aggressive pest control methods on our own. For example, spraying chemicals or having open bait stations like the mice traps that snap or anything like that, we would not want to do because it's a potential food hazard. You are able to use closed bait stations, pest strips, and glue boards. And again, these types of measures would more be for maintenance or for a very low level pest problem. Maybe you just saw a couple of ants one day. Anything above and beyond that, you want to make sure that you work with your pest control operator. They're going to be able to give you the best advice for controlling pests in your location while also ensuring food safety. So that's always our recommendation. So let's talk a little bit now about potentially hazardous foods. So a very ominous name, but really these are just the types of food that are most likely to grow harmful bacteria the most quickly. So things in this potentially hazardous food category include meat and poultry, dairy and eggs, seafood, baked potatoes, cooked rice, beans, and vegetables, tofu and soy proteins, and then certain processed produce. So things like sliced melons, cut tomatoes, cut leafy greens, and sprouts. I like to always mention that any food can be contaminated. These are just the ones that are most likely to be contaminated and the foods that are the most easy for bacteria to grow in. And that's because these tend to be moist and low acidity. So it's good for bacteria. It's a good environment for them. They like growing there, unfortunately. So for any of these refrigerated and frozen foods, all food needs to be stored in the refrigerator at 40 degrees or below. So we recommend keeping your fridge at about 37 to give you a little bit of wiggle room there. And then all frozen food, it's a good idea to set your freezer to 0 degrees. And then you want to equip all of your units with some type of internal thermometer so that you can monitor the temperature of your fridge and your freezer. If you don't have one of those, again, get a hold of our food bank team. We can get you set up with one. And then you want to make sure to record your temperatures as frequently as possible on temperature log sheets. And the reason for this is that if you were to, for example, to have an issue with one of your freezers, let's say, if you had temperature logs that showed the date and time that temperature was checked, then you'll be able to know exactly when that issue started. And you'll be able to also, for monitoring purposes, you'll be able to show that you've been storing food at a safe temperature. So it's good for all of those things. It's a good best practice to get into. We'll talk now about the temperature danger zone. The temperature danger zone is the range of temperatures where bacteria can grow the most rapidly. This encompasses the range of temperatures between 40 and 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is essentially any room and warm temperatures. And when we're talking about the temperature danger zone, we have what we call a 4-hour rule. So we always want to minimize the time that food is held in the temperature danger zone, right? No time in the temperature danger zone is ideal. But the 4-hour rule states that if potentially hazardous food is held in the temperature danger zone for more than 4 hours, it must be thrown away. Again, 4 hours is really the top maximum end of time before the food is unsafe. If it's a really hot day, you have even less time. And of course, we always want to minimize the time regardless. I also like to mention here that this 4-hour rule is cumulative. So, when you put it back in the fridge and take it back out, it doesn't restart. So for example, if you went and picked it up from the grocery store and you had 45 minutes, let's say, between when you picked it up at the grocery store, put it in your cart, and then when it went into your fridge at home or at your pantry, then you've got 45 minutes. Then let's say you take it out to cook with it and you leave it out for another half an hour while you're kind of getting other things ready. Now it's been out for a total of 45 minutes plus that half an hour. So it doesn't reset when you put it back in the refrigerator or the freezer. So I always like to mention that. So let's say that you are taking ground beef out of the freezer for clients that you think are picking up from your pantry at 1 p.m. Excuse the home delivery title on this slide. That's not applicable. But then at 5:15, you learn that there's still a couple packs left over. Maybe the people forgot to swing by or the ground beef didn't make it in the bag. At that point, can you put them back in the freezer? So the answer to that question is no. It was over 4 hours, but for very potentially hazardous food like ground beef, of course, like we mentioned, we always want to stick with even less than 4 hours. So at this point, this is definitely not safe to eat or distribute anymore. So in a similar vein, let's say that you are closing up the pantry for the day and then someone walks in with extra cabbage, potatoes, and frozen meat from their farm. What would you want to do with this food and why? So in this situation, cabbage and potatoes, wonderful. Obviously you would want to check them out, make sure they looked good, they weren't rotting, didn't have any pests on them, things like that. But then the frozen meat is always a tough one. We get a lot of questions about donations of meat and eggs. And it is okay for us to accept frozen meat from a farmer as long as it has been processed by an approved processor. So if they're doing their own processing and they themselves are not an approved processor, unfortunately, we would not be able to take that. But as long as they can tell you where they got their meat processed at, and then when you look at the packaging, it has some type of little seal that mentions that this processor is inspected by the Department of Ag and Markets, then you're good to go. So always check for that, and that will help you know if it's okay to accept that meat from the public. And then, of course, you always want to check on the conditions and temperature of the product too, right? If it comes in and it's not even cold anymore, you would say, thank you, but no thank you on that donation. And you would, of course, want to look too for any evidence of thawing, discoloration, ice crystals that might indicate that it thawed out and then it got put back in the freezer. All of those things would be some good things to check on. I like to mention here too that it is okay to also accept eggs, donations of eggs from the community. The only caveat here is that some people wash their eggs and then refrigerate them. So that's why, especially in the US, you always see eggs in the refrigerator. Sometimes in other countries, or, just depending on someone's personal practices with their chickens that they have at home, eggs actually are okay to eat without being refrigerated because they, when an egg is first laid, it has what we call a bloom on the outside, which is essentially a protective layer that comes from the chicken and protects that egg from bacteria getting in. So technically it is okay to have eggs that have not been refrigerated as long as that bloom hasn't been washed off. So that's okay in general life. However, for distribution to the public and for serving at a pantry or a meal site, unfortunately, we can only distribute or use eggs that have been refrigerated. So if someone wants to donate eggs to you, that's wonderful. As long as they've been refrigerated and the person can kind of tell you about their practices, that's great. Unfortunately, if they're not refrigerating their eggs, we would not want to take and distribute those for use at the pantry. So now let's talk about, let's say you have an open refrigerator. So you come to work at your kitchen on a Tuesday and you figure out that the refrigerator door was accidentally left cracked open all night. So the thermometer reads 60, so it's well above the temperature danger zone at this point. And in the refrigerator, there are apples, mozzarella cheese, beef, celery, and sliced cantaloupe. What should you do with these foods and why? If you were in this situation, you'd want to think about your potentially hazardous foods. So out of this list, the potentially hazardous foods would be the mozzarella cheese, the beef, and the sliced cantaloupe. Apples and celery are okay. We're not too concerned about temperature control on those, provided that they haven't been processed or sliced. If they're just a whole apple and a whole celery, they're good to go. So we're not too worried about those. The mozzarella cheese, beef, and sliced cantaloupe, though, because they're potentially hazardous foods and the refrigerator was cracked open all night, we don't know exactly when it got up to 60 degrees, we would have to discard those. A similar situation, if your power ever goes out, the refrigerator, as long as it's left closed to keep that cold air that is in there sealed inside, the food should be good for about 4 hours. Again, we're using our 4-hour rule here, since technically a refrigerator that doesn't have power, the food is out of temperature control, we would say. So the food is good for up to 4 hours. Unfortunately, if the power outage persists past 4 hours and we can't find another place to store the food in safe storage, then that food will have to be discarded after 4 hours. Our guidance for a freezer, again, a freezer that's left closed to keep the cold air sealed in. If the freezer is half full, the food should be good for about 1 day. If the freezer is packed full, then the food should be good for about 2 days. And again, this is because freezer food is kept well below the temperature danger zone. So we've got some more wiggle room until that food hits the temperature danger zone. And when a freezer is more full, the cold temperature that's kind of being held in the food that's in there kind of helps to keep the rest of the food in the freezer cold. So that's why you have a little bit more time with a freezer. If you have a longer term power outage, I know some things that have happened in the past, or that sometimes the electric companies will provide dry ice for support. Sometimes that's an option, especially if if the power company knows that power is going to be out for quite a while. Sometimes you are able to store it at another location. Again, make sure to run it past the food bank first so that we can approve that location for you to store your food at. But those are some options for if you know that your power is going to be out for quite a while. So another big concern with food safety, especially at pantries and meal sites, is food allergies. We call these the big nine. It used to be the big eight, but they just added sesame recently. And so the most common food allergies are to milk, eggs, soy, fish, tree nuts, peanuts, crustacean shellfish like crab, lobster, and shrimp, wheat or gluten, and then, like we mentioned, sesame is a new one. So these are the most common allergies that we might run into when serving the public. Managing food allergies in a pantry setting, you always want to do your best to prevent cross contact. So if you know that you have a food in stock that has allergens, ideally you would store that separately from food that is allergen free. You would want to use dedicated pallets and bins for products that contain allergens. And if you ever did have a spill of a food that was an allergen or contained an allergen, you would want to make sure to isolate that spill, check out whether it could have splashed or gotten onto any other foods in the area, dispose any products that came in contact with that spill, and then clean and sanitize the area. So if you are serving someone who has an allergy and they're looking for foods that might work for them, here are some things that you could do to help them figure out which foods will and will not work. They probably have a pretty good idea themselves, but this is just one way that you can be supportive. A lot of times there will be a certification on the package that might say lactose free, it might say gluten free or allergen free. Those are all good things to look for. You can always check the ingredients list for them, and then also keep an eye out for allergen alerts near the ingredients list. A lot of times companies will specifically call out the allergens in their products. And then it's also important to know that someone who has a very severe allergy might need to not only avoid the allergen itself, but also even food that was processed in the same facility as the allergen. Foods have a warning near their ingredient list that says something along the lines of made in a facility that also processes blank, whether that's wheat, nuts, whatever it might be. And so someone with a really severe allergy might need to avoid those type of products as well, even if the product itself doesn't contain the allergen. So again, you can always ask your clients to let you know what foods work for them, but these are some things you can look out for if you're helping them make some selections. So how about food recalls? So a food recall is whenever there's a voluntary removal of product from commerce when there's some reason to believe that it could have been contaminated or mislabeled. So we get notices about recalls from Feeding America, or our kind of parent agency, and we will always inform our partner agencies of recalled items that have been distributed by the food bank or through local sources. So we'll let you know via email, phone call, etc. Especially if it was a product that we distributed, we will make sure that you know. We keep records of who ordered each item on our menu. So as soon as we hear of a recall, we're able to pull up a record of who we need to contact, who has received that item. Now, if it's something that you did not receive from the food bank, it's always a good idea to keep an eye on the news. CDC is also a great source for food recalls. And if you did notice that you had something in your inventory that had been recalled, you would want to get a hold of us. We could give you some guidance. Sequester that food away from your other food and do not distribute it until we can give you some further guidance on that. But we will always do our best to keep a good eye on what's going on in the food recall space, and we'll let you know next steps, especially if it's a food bank product. So here's a new scenario. So let's say that you have placed an order from the food bank and you were planning to offer whole chickens that you ordered from our menu for a holiday meal. But you notice that the chicken is only offered in 12-pound bulk cases and they're all frozen together. So you were hoping for individually wrapped chickens. Should you still order this product and just try to repack it, or should you leave that product alone? Unfortunately, for something like chicken, you cannot repack it into smaller packages. So if you cannot use the larger bulk case, maybe you're a meal site cooking for a large group of people and you can use that. Maybe you have a really large family that comes in and you think that they could use it. But unfortunately, things like chicken, you're not able to repack. So things that you can repack are anything that would qualify as an unprocessed agricultural product. So something like onions, apples, potatoes, those do not require a license to process or to repack. You are good to go to repack those into smaller bags if you would like. Unfortunately, anything else would require a special license from the Department of Agriculture and Markets. And again, if you ever have questions about what can and cannot be repacked, feel free to get a hold of us. We'll let you know. If you are repacking some of these unprocessed agricultural products, always make sure to do so on a clean, sanitized surface, repacking into clean, fresh bags. having washed our hands and using some type of barrier like gloves. Those are all best practices for the things that you can repack. And then a lot of our partners are getting into home delivery. So some important things to think about when it comes to delivering food, of course, are going to be our time and temperature rules, making sure that we're aware of the temperature danger zone and keeping our 4-hour rule and minimizing time exposed to the temperature danger zone in mind. It's always a good idea to make sure that if you are delivering to someone's home, that they are home or at least coming home soon, and that they're going to be able to get that food into temperature control, right? If you just kind of leave potentially hazardous foods at someone's door and we don't know exactly when they're going to be getting back and be able to put that in their fridge, we would probably not want to do that just because we don't know how long it's going to be sitting out. Of course, you can also use some temperature controls in your vehicle. For example, if you're making multiple deliveries and you know you're going to be on the road for a while, you could have a cooler, you could have some thermal blankets. If you're delivering food maybe from your meal site that is hot, you could have a thermal bag. Lots of considerations for home delivery. Again, if you would like some guidance, feel free to reach out to us or some of the other partner agencies who are already doing home delivery. A lot of them have kind of well-established best practices in place that help them with their food safety on their home deliveries. So as we come up on the end of the section that's applicable to food pantries, just some other resources that I wanted to share. We do have some resources on our food bank website in the partner portal. You can see there that I've circled our little food safety section of the partner portal. And so this is where you can find different resources about food safety, food dating, things like that. We also have something on there called the HipNap self-assessment tool. So this is almost a little quiz that you can go through and just kind of self-assess, make sure that you're doing well in the food safety department. I found that some partners really like to have their volunteers fill out this self-assessment tool every once in a while for them, and it helps them to get kind of more familiar with food safety needs. And it gets your volunteers kind of in the mindset of thinking about and checking on food safety things while they're looking around the space. And then, of course, the FDA, CDC, and USDA websites all have good, credible food safety information as well. So at this point, if you are a food pantry that does not serve meals, you are good to go. Make sure that you fill out the questions here. And we'll have both food pantries and meal sites fill out the questions that'll pop up here. And then if you're a food pantry, you are welcome to close down the training at this point. We will make sure that you get a food safety certificate and that we document that you completed this on behalf of your organization. So thank you for being here with us. And then for our meal site partners, you will also fill out these questions since storing food also applies to you. And then you'll stick with us for this last section of the training as well, which will be followed by one more short section of questions. All right, so for our meal site friends, thanks for sticking with us. So this section will cover safe food preparation. So some basic prep guidelines. Fresh produce, we always want to be rinsing. We are going to talk about cleaning and sanitizing your food contact surfaces like cutting boards. We're going to talk a little bit about cross-contamination. Another best practice is to use separate clean utensils for tasting food. Obviously, we want to make sure that what we're making is going to taste good to people. But when you do so, make sure to use a clean separate utensil and to taste it, not leaning over the pot or anything like that. And then a large section of what we'll talk about here is how to thaw, cook, and reheat food properly. So let's start out with this scenario. Let's say that you are cutting up chicken for dinner on a plastic cutting board before cooking it. You then rinsed off your cutting board and you used a clean, sanitized knife to cut up lettuce and tomatoes for a salad. Is this salad safe to eat? And if not, what would be a solution? In this case, you would not want to use that same cutting board. Rinsing is not sanitizing. So there still could be pathogens from that raw chicken that are now going to be transferred to the lettuce and tomatoes. And theoretically, the lettuce and tomatoes probably are not going to be cooked before they're served to the public. So those pathogens are going to be able to continue living on those lettuce and tomatoes. Potential solutions would be to use a separate cutting board and a separate knife to prepare those two different foods. Another solution would be to clean and sanitize the cutting board before cutting up something different on it. And a third solution would be that you could have designated cutting boards for different types of foods. A lot of times meal sites will have a certain set of cutting boards that is only for preparing meats and other potentially hazardous foods. And then another set of cutting boards that's labeled for only ready to eat foods or produce, cheeses, things like that. So that can be a really good idea as well. I know we just touched on food allergies for pantries, and of course those pieces of guidance apply for meal site food storage as well. But obviously there's a little bit more to it when it comes to actually preparing foods. Of course, you still want to make sure that cross-contamination is not happening. You want to make sure that the food is being stored well. And those tips for identifying allergens on a food label are going to be really important as well. Obviously, with a meal sites, you will have some additional requirements. So one of the requirements from the state is that this food allergies poster is posted somewhere in your kitchen. It is available on our food bank website, so just make sure that you have that posted somewhere in your kitchen. And then we've provided the common food allergies poster as well. Again, that's also on our website. This one isn't required, but it can be a good kind of supplement to that first poster to remind your volunteers and your staff what the common food allergies are. In addition to preventing any cross-contamination in the food storage area, when you're preparing food that contains allergens, you want to be extra careful about sanitizing and preventing cross-contact. So ideally, you would use separate preparation tools for foods that contain allergens and foods that do not. Of course, if you are working with a food allergen and you're going to be also preparing other portions of the meal, you want to make sure to wash, rinse, and sanitize any of your utensils and your food prep areas and your hands. And then having a conversation with customers about their food allergies is going to be one of the most important things you can do. Make it a norm in your food distribution or your meal site to ask people if they have any allergies that you need to be aware of. And if someone does share that they have an allergy, obviously taking it very seriously. Be ready to discuss the ingredients in your dish with, the people preparing the food and with the customer to make sure that it works for them. And if you're not sure if an item could potentially have an allergen in it, or you can't guarantee that there has been no cross contact, advise your customer or your client of that and let them make the call. Again, if you have any questions about food safety for food allergens, please feel free to reach out to us. Now let's talk about thawing food properly. So I know personally, I grew up always, that was what our family did. We always thawed our meat on the counter. Probably a lot of you are similar. Unfortunately, especially for serving the public, that is not going to be an acceptable method of thawing food. So some things you could do instead would be to thaw your food in the refrigerator at 40 degrees or below. You can also do so submerged under running drinkable water at a temperature of 70 or below, so kind of room temperature to cool water. And you can do that while the product is still wrapped in its packaging. And so you can either run it under a gently running stream of water under the tap, or you can just put it in a bowl full of the water and then change that water out every 30 minutes. This technique is going to be a little bit faster than refrigerator thawing. You can also use a microwave to thaw if you're going to cook the food immediately after thawing. If you're not going to cook the food immediately, then option 1 or 2 is probably going to be a better bet. And then you can also always thaw as part of the cooking process, just keeping in mind that, of course, it's going to take a little bit longer for a food to go from frozen to cooked than from refrigerated to cooked. So now when we do get into cooking, these are the minimum temperatures that these different types of food should be cooked to. Of course, you can use your meat thermometer to check the temperature during and after the cooking process. For poultry, stuffing, and any type of stuffed meat, you want to make sure that it comes up to an internal temperature of 165 and that it holds that temperature for at least 15 seconds. For ground beef, sausage, and eggs that are going to be hot held, the temperature is 155. For any type of chop or steak, the temperature is going to be 145. Same thing for fish. And then for leftovers or for any mixed dishes that maybe has multiple types of foods within it, the temperature is going to be 165. So some thermometer basics. There's always going to be instructions on the package that will help you make sure that you are using them properly. They can be a little bit fragile and finicky, so make sure you're always handling them with care and storing them in a safe location. And then it's going to be really important to prevent cross-contamination by cleaning and sanitizing those thermometers between each use. So that's, of course, between different meals that you make. But I also like to remind people that that also applies for taking the temperature of the same thing. So for example, let's say that you are cooking a chicken breast and you take it out of the oven, you put your thermometer in, and it's not quite up to 165 yet. So then you stick your chicken breast back in the oven. Then the next time you take it out, if you use that same thermometer without sanitizing it first, then you're taking pathogens from when it was not at 165 yet and basically inserting them back into the chicken. Clean and sanitize between each time you use the thermometer, even if you're using it on the same food. So it's also going to be important with thermometers to just check them periodically to make sure that they're still reading accurately. And we'll talk here about how to recalibrate a thermometer if needed. A lot of times the digital thermometers are not going to need recalibration. There's not really a way to do that. But if you are using these thermometers that have a needle and a face like this, then you can use the ice method. How you would do that would be that you would place crushed ice in a container. You would let it melt to about half ice and half water and stir it to make sure it's all a uniform temperature. And then you could stick the end of your thermometer probe in there. And you would want to be looking for it to be 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And so you can check in using this method, both digital and these other types of thermometers. Like I said, you won't really be able to recalibrate your digital one necessarily. It's still good to check on it every once in a while to make sure it's still reading accurately. But then for these kind of clock face type of thermometers, you are able to actually change those and recalibrate them. And they do need that once in a while. So if you use the ice method and your thermometer is not reading 32 degrees Fahrenheit, then what you can do is you can keep the tip of the water in that ice bath, and you can find yourself a little wrench and just turn that calibration nut right under the face until the red indicator reads 32. If you ever notice that your thermometer has kind of gotten out of whack, this is a good way to recalibrate it. Now, again, when you are checking food's temperature, of course, like we talked about, clean, sanitized thermometer, we love it. Then you'll want to take the temperature in several areas of the food. So make sure that the food has all come up to the proper temperature, not just in one spot. You always want to make sure that you take the temperature in the center or in the thickest part of the food, since that is the part that's going to take the longest to come up to temperature. If there's a bone in the meat or the poultry that you're taking the temperature of, you want to make sure that your tip of your thermometer is in the meat or the muscle part, not touching the bone. So now let's talk quick about cooling food safely. So we all know kind of that we need to thaw the food right, we need to cook the food right, but sometimes once we have the cooking part done, we think we're kind of home free and we're all set. But the cooling process is still really important. Let's say that we have a 15-gallon stock pot of beef stew in a regular walk-in cooler at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. How long would this take to come down from out of the temperature danger zone? So it would actually take 6 days to cool this pot of beef stew down to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which was absolutely mind-blowing to me when I heard this for the first time. Obviously, this is a bit of an extreme example because it's a very large pot, it's a very thick type of food, so that makes it take a little bit longer even. But it's a good reminder just that it can take a really long time to get things down to the proper temperature, especially depending on what type of food it is. And so if it's not getting down out of the temperature danger zone within the allotted amount of time, that can be a problem, right? So just like taking food out of the refrigerator and letting it sit out of the temperature danger zone is a problem. It's a problem too if it's already in the refrigerator, but it hasn't actually gotten down to temp. Here are some things that you can do to cool food safely. Reducing the size is a big one, right? We want to maximize the amount of contact surface that's available for the food to come into contact with the cold air in the fridge or in the freezer. If we can reduce the size, or if we can split it up into separate containers, that helps. A shallow pan, like most of you have in your kitchens, is also great for distributing the food and giving it more contact surface to be cooled down. An ice water bath can also be a great idea. So if you put the bottom of your pot or the bottom of your bowl into an ice water bath, that can help kind of remove some of that heat from the food. Another thing I've heard people do is some meal sites have an ice paddle, or basically a spoon or a spatula that has liquid inside and can be frozen in the freezer. And then you can take that ice paddle out when it's time to cool your food down and stir your food with that ice paddle. That can help as well. Then, of course, if you happen to have a blast chiller, that's more of a commercial kitchen thing, but if you happen to have one, that's wonderful as well. And we never want to put our food in the refrigerator when it's piping hot, because it can actually bring down the overall temperature of the refrigerator. Once you serve your food, try to let it cool down, split it up into multiple containers, try to let it cool down for a little bit before you stick it right in the fridge. Leaving the lids off of a product can also help with this. So if you are going to do this, say you have a shallow pan of something, if you leave the lid off that shallow pan, that can help so that the heat isn't getting trapped in there. If you are going to do that, make sure you put those pans on the upper shelves of your refrigerator, just so that nothing can fall into them while they're uncovered. And making sure to have good air circulation in your coolers and freezers is going to be really important as well. So we don't want to overcrowd the fridge or stack pans all on top of each other, just because that makes it really hard for the fridge to maintain its temperature and for the cold air to get to everything. And when we do put our things in the refrigerator, we want to, of course, label them with the date and time that they were prepared, so that other staff and volunteers at our meal site know how long they're good for. And then while the food is cooling, it's a good idea to continue to check its temperature to make sure it has cooled all the way down to 40 degrees. So for a little bit of additional detail, we have a little bit more wiggle room with cooling food down than the 4-hour rule. The 4-hour rule, in my opinion, is still a good thing to just kind of keep in mind for cooling food. But technically, we need the food to come down to at least 70 degrees within 2 hours, because the 70 to 140 range is the most dangerous part of the temperature danger zone. And then if we do get it down to below 70 within 2 hours, then we have 4 additional hours to get it from 70 down to 40. So technically you have 6 total hours, provided that it's below 70 within the first 2 hours when we're talking about cooling food. Again, if that's kind of too much to remember, I know it sometimes is for me, 4-hour rule is still a good idea. Get it cooled down as fast as you can. Now let's talk about food storage within our refrigerator. Ideally, this is a good order to store food in your cold storage areas. And we always want to have our ready to eat foods at the top, or if anything is uncovered in the fridge, we want those things to be higher up so that nothing can fall down into them. So ready to eat food is anything that is not going to be cooked or cooked again before we serve it to the public. So salads, anything like that can be a ready to eat food. And then underneath that, ideally, we would want to go seafood, cuts of beef and pork, ground meat, ground fish, and eggs, with poultry products on the bottom. And the reason for this, obviously, right, we know we want to have our ready to eat foods up and safe, out of the drip range of anything else. And of course, ideally, we don't want things dripping around in our fridge anyway, but we still can take some precautions just in case. And so the reason for this order is that seafood only needs to be cooked to 145 degrees to be safe, whereas poultry, for example, needs to be cooked to 165 to be safe. If some seafood drips down onto the poultry, again, we don't want things dripping, but let's just say that something did, then we would still be cooking that poultry to 165, so it would still be okay, because the pathogens from the seafood would still get up to the right temperature to be cooked off when the poultry is cooked. If we had this in the reverse order, and poultry, which contains pathogens that need to be cooked off at 165, happen to contaminate the seafood below it that's only being cooked to 145, then we could have a little bit more of a problem. So that's the reason for this recommended order. Again, I know a lot of us have crowded fridges and we have lots of things we're trying to store, so this might not always be perfectly possible, but to the extent that you can, this is a good idea. So when we're serving food, it's always best practice to keep hot food hot, so above 140, above the temperature danger zone, and to keep our cold foods cold, so below 40, below the temperature danger zone. So we call this hot holding and cold holding. So if you have a steam table that you can use to keep your hot foods hot, that's wonderful. If you can set your cold foods on ice during serving, that's wonderful as well. And then of course, when we're serving, we want to use separate utensils for each of these foods. Foods that need a barrier, so foods that you would not want to touch with your bare hands, would include any prepared fresh produce that's being served raw, cold meats and sandwiches, any type of baked good, ice that we're serving to guests. And one other thing that I like to mention is that it's good to have an ice scoop rather than scooping right into the ice bin with a glass or a plastic cup, because those things could chip and then fall off into the ice and we don't know it's there. Any food that's not going to be cooked or reheated again after it's prepared, we want to use a barrier for. And anything that is ready to eat, like cookies or anything like that. Gloves are a good idea in general for food prep as well, but they're an absolute requirement for foods like this that are not going to be cooked again. So how can you serve these foods? Like we said, gloves are wonderful. Tongs can work, both ideally. And one thing I like to also mention at this point of the training is that if you have a situation at your meal site where clients are coming up and kind of going through a serving line, it's a best practice to have the meal site staff and volunteers do the actual serving. Still make sure that people get their choice of what they'd like and that they can choose how much and what they want on their plate, but have the volunteers actually place those items on their plate so that we know that there's no cross-contamination happening. So now we're all done with our meal. Clients have been served. It's a great day. And now it's time to clean and sanitize. So what are the things that we need to clean and sanitize? Pots and pans, of course, glasses, dishes, cooking equipment, and anything that came into contact with food. I like to just talk quickly about cleaning versus sanitizing. They're not the same thing. Cleaning is basically removing food, dirt, or debris from a surface, and all surfaces need cleaning, right? So we should be cleaning our walls, floors, storage shelves, garbage containers, all of those things. But the things that come into contact with food also need sanitizing. So sanitizing is the process that reduces the pathogens, bacteria, the viruses on a surface to safe levels. Anything that has contact with food needs to be sanitized as well. So if you have a dishwasher, that is wonderful. The dishwasher does the cleaning and the sanitizing all in one round, and you're good to go. If you are a meal site that uses a 3-compartment sink like this, then this will probably look very familiar to you. You'll want 1 compartment for washing, 1 compartment for rinsing, and 1 compartment for sanitizing. In your sanitizer compartment, you can use any type of food safe sanitizer. You can use a bleach solution, or you can use really hot water. Again, if you are using any type of sanitizer there, make sure to follow the package directions as far as diluting it. And then also it should tell you something too about how long the plates or the other utensils need to sit in that sanitizer before they can be removed. So again, we call that contact time. Make sure you're following the manufacturer's directions for contact time. And then for cleaning and sanitizing your food prep surfaces, it's a pretty similar process. Obviously, you want to scrape and wipe down any actual debris that's on those surfaces. You can wash it with a soap solution, rinse it off, and then you want to use your sanitizer here as well. And to make sure that you have enough contact time for the sanitizer on these surfaces, you could just let it air dry. So if you wipe on your bleach solution or whatever sanitizer that you prefer, and you let that air dry, that'll make sure it has plenty of contact time to do what it needs to do with those pathogens. And by the time you're ready to use it again, it'll be good to go, sanitized and dry. Key messages here, obviously foodborne illness is serious and is especially important at meal sites. It can impact the people that we serve. Safe food starts with the workers. And then when you are thinking about how safe food is at your organization, these are some good kind of checkpoints to keep in mind. So if you're doing a self-assessment, there are important steps for food safety at each of these points. You can think about your receiving practices, how food comes in and is evaluated. You can think about your storing practices, the temperatures that you're storing food at, the cleanliness and the ventilation in your storage areas, how long things are being stored. You might have your distribution point if you're a food pantry. You have good food safety information for preparing your food, for cooking your food, for serving your food, and then your cleanup. When you're thinking through whether you have all the food safety processes in place that you need to, this is a good way to kind of break down your processes into steps and implement some good policies at each one of these checkpoints. Now you will take part 2 of your little quiz here. Again, we'll send you your food safety certificate once we receive this quiz from you. Thank you for being here with us today. We appreciate everything that you do. And again, always feel free to reach out to our food bank team here if you have any questions at all about food safety. We're always happy to help. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.